This episode is sponsored by Yellow Images.
Hey, what's up guys? Christian here for Kriscoart. I wanted to start the year by experimenting with something new that I found very interesting. So today we're learning to create low poly art. Low poly is essentially imitating a retro aesthetic that was common in the early days of computer graphics when the processing power available wasn't high enough to render fully smoothed out geometry that we're used to seeing in games and in CGI now. Now, in order to deal with these limitations, developers and artists back then had to essentially represent their objects and meshes with as little polygons as possible. Now, polygons are essentially 3D pixels for 3D objects, and usually images made in this style use polygons that are in a triangular shape. The connecting points in the shape are called vertices, and vertices are the points in which all the polygons connect. It might seem like details, but this is what's gonna make your low poly art stand out and look great. But I know that you're itching to get started, so let's jump into Photoshop and let's see how we can fake all of this into 2D. So today we're going to create a desert landscape with some Western elements. And this is where today's sponsor comes in, and I think you guys will find this marketplace super useful for anything that is design and Photoshop. So Yellow Images is a unique online marketplace with 3 platforms. They have over 23,000 object mockups for branding and packaging design, ranging from apparel, vehicles, advertising, and more. And some of these can even be purchased with a 3D format and FBX. And if you don't find exactly what you're looking for, then Yellow Images can make it for you. Then there is the Creative Store, which is a huge collection of ready-to-use graphic assets from creatives around the world. And there's some amazing stuff in here, and ever since I discovered it, I actually find myself just scrolling through these assets, and I just get inspired for all kinds of ideas. So we'll be using some of the light elements and some overlays from here to polish things off in the end. And then finally, they have a very unique 360 object library where you can spin super high quality objects in different views and place them directly into your scene since they have a transparent background. Now, some of these assets are objects shot in a studio while others are 3D objects. And in our scene today, we're going to be using their low poly stuff to add props, structures, and things like that in our landscape. Now that's gonna be a lot of fun, and it's super easy to do because they even have an action or an extension inside of Photoshop where you can search and rotate around things and drop them directly into your composition without ever leaving Photoshop. Now, before getting into that, let's first create our environment. So we're going to start from a picture and slowly convert it into low poly. Now, this is a picture I took with my phone while in the desert, and resolution doesn't really matter too much since we are only using this as reference for colors and shapes and shadows. So let's get started and let's jump into Photoshop and let's see how we can convert this into low poly.
All right, so inside of Photoshop, the first thing that we're gonna do is split up our picture into different sections. So for this, we're gonna select the lasso tool, and a shortcut for that is L. And we're just gonna trace around these mountains piece by piece. So we'll start with the left one over here, the background ones, and the foreground rock over here on the right. And then from there, you just wanna make sure that you rename every layer that you just cut out into sections. Okay, so let's start with this left mountain. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna duplicate this section or this layer. And if you option click on your Mac, right in between the layers, the top layer will sort of be nested with the bottom layer. So it's kind of looking at the shape or the alpha information of the bottom layer. Essentially, the top layer is only showing what is confined within the bottom layer. So now we want to do that because we want to start creating triangles and texture on the top layer, but we still want to be within the shape of the mountain. Now that we have made a selection, we're just going to go under Filter, Blur, and Average. And this is going to look at all the pixels within that section, and it's just going to take the average of those colors and make that a solid color. So this is how we're going to create our polygons in our scene. And you can see me going through this. I'm just going to keep repeating these steps and making sure, like I said in the beginning, that the vertices are connecting, that I'm making triangles and not other weird shapes. And I'm keeping in mind also how the shape of the rock is, where there would be a surface or a polygon to represent that surface, how big, how small do I want it to be based on the shape of the mesh that we're trying to fake into 2D and where the shadows are landing. So you kind of need to just have some thought into this. Don't just make random triangles to fill up the space, but try to imagine what this picture would look like if it was made as a 3D mesh. All right, so I'm going to do the same thing for the mountain on the right and then for the background mountains. Everything else kind of happens on its own. We're getting the same colors and the right textures from the original picture. The light is falling off in the right way. All the shadows are already there. Okay, so you get the point with that. Now the next step is creating our ground. We're gonna pick a color from our scene and maybe adjust it a little bit, make it a little bit lighter. And this is gonna be sort of our sand color for our ground. From there, I'm just gonna make a rectangular selection just to delete the sky. And then I'm going to repeat the same step, but with just a darker shade of that same brownish color for the shadows. And since we want to paint our shadows in, I'm going to create a matte layer for this layer, going to delete the top like we did earlier, and I'm also going to invert the matte layer by hitting Command I, and that's just going to invert my colors from white to black. And this way, when I'm tracing the shadows of the original picture with my lasso tool, I can paint in with a brush how much shadow I want. I also want to talk about ambient occlusion because it's kind of like a shadow, but not really. It's essentially creating a point of contact between your different elements and your geometry in your scene. So you can see that I did that for the bottom of the mountain, for the bottom of different elements, just to ground them a little bit more and just to make them feel like they're actually there. And then once again, I'm going to make another solid color. This time it's going to be a lighter brownish, and this will be for the dirt path that we have in the picture. So again, same thing. I'm just tracing what was there, and this way we're making sure that our perspective is right, that we're creating a realistic shape for a road, and everything fits in well together. Okay, so here I'm just going to drag in some props from the 360 library that I mentioned from Yellow Images, and I'm just adding in these low poly rocks. Right now I'm not using the extension because at the time of recording this part of the time lapse, I was on a train and I already saved some of these assets on my computer, so I didn't have to use the internet. So that's something else that you can do if you don't want to use the extension. And what I'm trying to do with adding these rocks, of course, I'm color correcting them. I'm just dropping in a hue and saturation, maybe some brightness and contrast. And I'm doing the same thing as earlier. So you're seeing me do over and over when I'm correcting these elements is I'm creating these effects and then I'm nesting them like I showed you earlier to make sure that those color corrections are only applied to that specific layer and not the whole image. So this is how I'm getting these rock elements to match with the mountains and the side of the mountains that they're in. And I've done this step for pretty much any element that I'm adding in because I want to make sure that it's adhering to my color palette and it's matching the right colors and light and shadows. Another thing that you see me do with the lasso tool is cutting out parts of these elements to give them different shapes and to make them adhere a little bit more to maybe the surface of this mountain. And then from there, of course, you can use all the transform properties, you can distort the mesh, you can really adapt it to what you need. And you can also not just add color correcting effects, but really any other layer or even a solid color, for example. And this was another way for me to match the color. I would just pick a color or a similar color to what's already in my scene, and I would sort of overlay it or nest it into any other element that I'm bringing into my composition. Not only that, you can also create multiple solid colors, so you can now start creating different shades within an object. So you can see that I did that for the grass elements over here, where maybe there's a part of it that's being illuminated by the sun, and then the rest of it is falling in shadows. So you can do that by having two different solid colors nested into that plant layer. And I've done that pretty much all over for the rocks, for the plants. And another thing that I've done is also sort of paint in light, as you can see here in the example of this bonfire scene. And I'm doing this because I really want to make sure that I can add as many details as possible in terms of light and just object interaction without taking away from the minimal aesthetic of the whole scene. So as you can see, this is where the extension comes in super handy because I'm literally previewing the right angle, the right rotation of each object before it's even placed into my composition. And then from there, it's super easy to just move that around and correct it like I showed you earlier. So I definitely prefer using the extension quite a bit whenever I'm not editing on a train or on a plane. And these assets are super high quality, and they were just so fun to have these really complex structures and just these 3D objects already made for you, so you can just focus on being creative and just dropping them in wherever you want into your scene. So we've talked about how to paint shadows in with the lasso tool, but sometimes some objects are going to have a very specific shadow that you're going to want to create another way. So what I did for some of these elements that I'm dropping in is simply duplicating them and kind of squishing them down onto the ground by using the transform properties. So I'm using perspective a lot. I'm also just using scale and rotation to make sure that they're aligned with the source of the light, of where it's coming from. And it was particularly tricky for the plants, the lower plants, because I kind of wanted to make sure that they were all adhering to that source. So I had to kind of rotate them little by little. And to do this in a way that was pretty consistent, I used an overlay that was just a bunch of perspective lines just to make sure that I was angling them right as I moved along in my scene. Then next up, with a soft brush with very low opacity, I just started adding some atmospheric effects. So you can lightly add some blue strokes behind the mountains just to give a little bit more atmosphere. You can add a little bit of maybe dust, so you can again reintroduce some version of that brownish color that you were using earlier to kind of amalgamate the scene even further by adding some dust atmosphere, or even adding a solid color as an overlay like I did in the end, and just dropping the opacity to something like 5% or very low, so that at least you're just introducing more and more colors that are bringing all the colors in your scene closer together. And then with some final color grading touches, your Western low poly landscape is complete.
And there you go. With these principles, you can honestly start making all kinds of low poly art. And with yellow images, you can add some really cool elements that can make your visuals stand out and feel so much more intricate. You can also join Yellow Images as an author, so you can start making some money in the marketplace. I hope you found this video useful, and if you make any low poly art, I would love to see it. So follow me on Instagram and tag me in any creations that you make. I'm really excited for all the amazing projects lined up in this new year, and I want to thank Yellow Images for opening a world of incredibly useful assets for me and for sponsoring this video, and thank you so much for watching. My name is Chris for Kriscoart, and I will see you next time.